Coast to Coast Live. Got another podcast for you in regards to hunting Jesse James and Quest of the Giant J book review. We're just going to get straight to it. We've got Declassified Files from Quest of the Giant J, which is a book written by author Ben Miller, a direct descendant of Jesse Woodson James, the Outlaw. And so first off, just straight out of the gate, there's a big red flag with Jesse Woodson James, the Outlaw, was apparently an Army colonel fighting for the Confederacy because he never surrendered. So we're now getting a completely new look at Jesse Woodson James, and due to the new evidence revealed in the book, we're forced to reconsider everything we ever were told about him in the first place. First and foremost, he was the colonel of the KGC, which was the legitimate spy division of the Confederate Army. So with over 200,000 Blood Oath members, they were larger than the CIA, FBI, and NSA combined, which is obviously quite powerful, quite extensive. Some say they were easily the most powerful spy network to ever operate on U.S. soil. Many of the KGC descendants were actually, many of the KGC members were actually descendants of the Revolutionary War, going back to George Washington's spy network. And so in chapter 1 and 2, Mr. Miller clarifies that Stonewall Jackson and Andrew Jackson were actually related after he himself plugged in his own Jackson ancestry into Ancestry.com, and it connected all three of their paternal lines to a guy named Sir Richard Jackson, who was a medieval knight, knighted by King James in the 1500s in England. And Mr. Miller's actual Jackson line dates all the way back to 1290 there in England. And so that's pretty interesting, because the medieval knight part is interesting because the Templars were actually granted the authority to run the banking system in England by King James back in the 1500s. So that's very interesting. And then Mr. Miller ties the KGC and the Knights Templars together by informing us that the inner circle of the KGC was actually the Knights Templars in America. And Jesse James, the Outlaw, was actually at the pinnacle and at the center of this Templar circle. And so he reveals that Jesse Woodson James fakes his death after robbing more trains and banks than anybody in history, fakes his death in 1882, and then goes on to build the Federal Reserve covertly, which was a covert military operation under Chicago, where they dug under Section 33, the Masonic 33, in the Gold Coast of Chicago, literally removed 16 miles out the back door of a bar on Madison Street so that nobody would even know that they were there, and completed the project with 33 miles. Again, the Masonic 33. And so they were connecting all the banks underground to the Federal Reserve located on Jackson and LaSalle. And then apparently the entire system is documented as being built by George W. Jackson. It says that he financed the entire thing, as well as built the entire thing, and that he was a Knights Templar and a Freemason, as if they were just the Cub Scouts or something. So in the book regarding the tunnel system, that's what it literally has him listed as a Knights Templar. And so now with Mr. Miller's information coming forward here, uh, confirming that that's just even more confirmation that he already has, now that he's now connected Jesse James directly to the tunnel system, um, and the Federal Reserve, and to the Giant J, which apparently also all kind of ties into the National Treasure movie, because in the National Treasure movie, they mentioned that Andrew Jackson knew where the Templar treasure was located. Um, at the beginning of the Civil War, apparently, it was Jesse James's responsibility to take care of the Templar treasure, which was part of the Confederate treasure. And it existed in the South at the beginning of the war. So the book actually, just completely paints an entire new picture of Jesse James altogether, completely. It's just completely not what we all thought was going on. our sur- our surroundings were not what we thought they were, apparently, because Jesse James ended up building the biggest bank in the world. And then Mr. Miller continues to clarify that there were two Jessies and two Franks. And the guy that they identified in Missouri as Jesse James was Jesse R. James, Jesse Robert James, and that name never surfaced in 1882. When they faked the death of Jesse Woodson James, they put the name Jesse Woodson James on the tombstone because that's who the authorities were looking for. But yeah, actually, it was, um, you know, it was Jesse Robert James that was from Clay County, Missouri. So that just never came out. And the KGC had known this and said uh, this and basically released this information over the decades, that they knew that the guy in Missouri was a teenager at the beginning of the war, so he couldn't have been the colonel who was coordinating um, raids behind enemy lines at the beginning of the war in 1861. So they just kind of laughed about it and kept it, under wraps, and it just kind of faded off into history. But the other issue is that there were obviously two sets of photos for both Jesse and both Franks, and they were obviously different people. So they were different size people. Jesse James was 5'7" from Missouri, Jesse Robert James, and Jesse Woodson James was over 6 feet tall. And there has been authenticated photos of uh, Jesse Woodson James and Frank James, Benjamin Franklin James from Tennessee, where Frank is in full Confederate uniform in Nashville with Jesse Woodson James, as well as Fletch Taylor, who was a Confederate from Wisconsin. So the Confederate Underground, the term Confederate Underground literally comes from the term that Jesse James created by literally taking the Confederacy underground, by literally building tunnels and vaults all over America where the treasure was stored and housed, and or either housed or removed. In the case of the Giant J, they removed a vein of gold, which is documented in the mineral patent. Speaking of mineral patents, well, we'll get to that in a minute. Before we get to the mineral patents, let's back up here to, so Jesse, the field commander of the KGC, was, the entire time he was an outlaw, was actually just doing his job as colonel of the KGC. Collecting gold for the KGC was his job. And sometimes, apparently, your job requires you to be an outlaw. And so now that all this is coming to light, we have a completely different view on his activities. But one thing as field commander that we wanted to point out here was the connection to General Stanwa T, who was a brigadier general and Cherokee chief for the Confederacy in charge of all Indian brigades. And Stanwa T was instrumental in helping Jesse James and the KGC build alliances with Indian chiefs. And so Jesse had built alliances with Chief Victoria of the Apache, as well as Sitting Bull of the Sioux. And so there had been a number of stories floating around the internet for decades, that were just unverifiable. One of them was that Jesse had traded City Bull repeating rifles, armed Sitting Bull, because to Jesse the Indians were allies, and he wanted to make sure his allies were well armed. And so the story was that Jesse had somehow made it to the Black Hills and, made an agreement with Sitting Bull that he would give Sitting Bull repeating rifles and training in exchange for exclusive access to the Black Hills and 2 wagon loads of gold that the Sioux had taken off of miners. And so that story was just, obviously that's an amazing story, but there was no way to verify any of that. It was just hearsay until Mr. Miller comes out with Quest of the Giant Jay and actually puts Jesse James in the Black Hills. And it's ironic because the place where the Giant Jay is located, the closest town to it, was in a place called Sitting Bull up until 1880. So when Custer rolled out there in 1876, him and the 7th Cavalry 300 soldiers of the 7th Cavalry were wiped out because they had no idea that they were going into a situation where the Sioux had been armed with repeating rifles and were basically just completely outnumbered. And Jesse James was already there in possession of the gold that Custer desired. So that is just mind-blowing. Absolutely mind-blowing. So Mr. Miller has completely rewritten history on Jesse Woodson James not even being from Missouri, but being from Tennessee and Kentucky as well, which again, the KGC knew this because they had documented and released over the years, over the decades, that they knew the real Jesse Woodson James, the field commander, was either from Tennessee or Kentucky. He wasn't from Missouri. And they knew that the guy from Missouri was his cousin, and that, the cousin was a teenager when the war began, so he couldn't have been the field commander. And so that's quite interesting as well, because it just shows the the connection and the obvious two Jessies, and they both had brothers named Frank that were also involved, which just led more to the confusion. So you can see how that plays out. Another interesting thing here is on the 1850 census, it has in Tennessee, it has Mr. Miller's 4th great grandfather is J.W. James. And on the 1850 census in Missouri, it has Jesse R. James. And then apparently on the 1860 census in Missouri, you could see that somebody used a black pen, felt tip pen, to change the R to a W, which actually came more out like an H. And so it does, but you can obviously see that it was altered in 1860 on the 1860 census, just in case anybody went back to look at the 1860 census to see if it was, if it said Jesse W. James, which it did not. It said Jesse R. James, but they altered it. And then nobody went back to the 1850 census because, they just didn't think to do that. But now it's quite clear that one also says Jesse R. James, because his dad's name was Robert. So Robert Salee James, who was actually the first cousin to Jesse Woodson James, who was actually, the same age as Jesse. So Jesse Woodson was actually 26 years older than his second cousin, basically, or first cousin one time removed, is actually what it is from Jesse Robert James. So Jesse Robert James was first cousins one time removed to Jesse Woodson. And so that's an interesting thing. Another interesting note here is that on the trains, Jesse, because he's listed on the 1850 census in Tennessee as a saddler. J.W. James is a saddler at 30 years old in 1850. And so that's interesting because he had been noted as showing an interest in people's hands when on the trains. And he would grab their hands and feel their hands for calluses. And if they had calluses, he would not take their money and would leave them alone. So it's evident that he had some type of respect for people that worked with their hands. And now that we know that he was a saddler, he also worked with his hands. So you could see the correlation there. Not to mention, he had been seen in southern Illinois, as well as places in Tennessee and surrounding areas, on a horse with a spectacular silver saddle. Just beautiful silver inlay. And, had really grabbed people's eyes to the point where it had been documented in southern Illinois that Jesse Woodson James was there, and that he had this beautiful saddle. So that all lines up as well. He was a saddler, had been seen with a beautiful silver saddle, all confirmed now for the first time. And so Mr. Miller also wanted to make sure in the highlights that, there's over 300 books written about Jesse James. And during his research, he read a lot of them. At least, many of them as far as what knowledge that they had. Certain things were just hearsay as far as stories go, which some were mostly unconfirmable. But others, out of the 300, there were only 2 that he could say actually had the information pertaining to verifying the 2 Jessies and the 2 Franks. So over the years, the certain KGC members and descendants had released that information so that people would know, so that the other people out there that needed to know would know the truth at some point. And so those 2 books, one was Shadow of the Sentinel by Bob Brewer and Warren Gettler, and another one was called the Black Book, is what it's called, which is basically, the subtitle is Jesse James was one of his names, who was the outlaw who lived an incredible life of 73 identities. And so some of the stuff in that book is also pretty hard to verify unless you have information that just confirms it or doesn't confirm it. And so some of the info on Jesse James was taken directly from that book because it was written by Del Schrader and Jesse James III, who was actually a relative of Mr. Miller's, apparently, presumably, because he was also related to Jesse James. So basically saying Jesse James III was basically saying that he was a great grandson or a grandson to Jesse James, which in that book I don't believe that was ever verified, that was true, that guy was actually related to Jesse at all. But many people believe that he was. So that was, but those two books are the only two out of the 300 that Mr. Miller said that he was able to confirm. But none of the books, the up until Quest of the Giant J, have ever been able to confirm who the real guy was, who Jesse James was, the real Jesse Woodson James. So for the first time in history, Mr. Miller completely rewrites the entire history on Jesse James, the Outlaw, and completely paints a new picture for us on who he was and his activities and why he was doing what he was doing. So another issue is that if you look at the numbers, it's the South had 100,000 more kills. And so 100,000 is a lot. How do you lose a war when you have 100,000 more kills? So some of the narrative doesn't seem to add up, especially now that we know what we know about what we just learned about the money. The KGC obviously didn't give up until they had control of the financial system, which is really what it was about. Some of the atrocities of the war were not really talked about, in the history that we were taught, because it doesn't fit their narrative. I think they reached 100,000 kills because Jesse had made these alliances with the Indians, and the Indian culture was a very warlike culture, and they definitely had a huge impact. And as a matter of fact, the book points out that General Stan Watie, and the Indian Brigades was the last general to leave the battlefield. And when he came in off the battlefield, they didn't have their weapons. So it's like they, where'd the weapons go? And it's like they surrendered, but they didn't really surrender. So that's also suspicious. And then the KGC, Jesse James obviously took the KGC underground and continued to add to the treasure for decades, all the way up until the Federal Reserve was basically built. So the next interesting thing is that Citibank became the holding company for the tunnel system under Chicago that was covertly dug by the KGC and Jesse James. And ironically, so the Federal Reserve was basically a collaboration between Citibank and the Bank of England to create the Federal Reserve. And sure enough, who do you think made the first deposit of gold into the New York Federal Reserve? Sure enough, Citibank. So Citibank becomes the holding company for the underground tunnel system under Chicago that's connected to the Giant J and to Jesse James and to the KGC. And they also end up depositing all this gold into the New York Federal Reserve. After George W. Jackson pays for this entire underground tunnel system that was more than Rockefeller had at the time, which, don't get us wrong. I mean, the don't get it wrong that the tunnel systems were not cheap by any means to build. Um, you know, by no extent of the imagination is it inexpensive to build a tunnel system underneath a city, let alone to do it covertly. And they apparently did use the most advanced equipment at the time. They didn't, they didn't skimp on expenses or anything like that. They used the most advanced stuff that they could get, the most advanced tunnel making machines that there were out there at the time, and the costs were astronomical. Okay, and so that was another thing that raised a lot of flags was, you know, the tunnels. There were a lot of tunnels. Okay, I mean obviously 16 miles worth of tunnels covertly, 33 miles worth of tunnels is a lot of tunnels. Um, and that's just one set of tunnels. There were many tunnel situations going on that the KGC were involved with that is pointed out in the book. And so, unbelievable. So, if it's not enough to completely rewrite history on Jesse James, um, the Battle of Little Bighorn, um, you know, and another thing to point out is that it's obvious that the Confederacy, they also offered freedom to any slaves that would fight for the Confederacy. I mean, there was slavery on both sides, the North and the South, but the North did not have Native American generals. Okay, and a lot of the African American slaves ended up fighting under General Stanwa T with the Indians and fought for the Confederacy. And, so again, was the last general to leave the battlefield. So they definitely had a huge impact on the overall numbers. And, and it's just, it doesn't also again fit their narrative that the North was the righteous ones, and the South Confederate flag people were a bunch of racists. I mean, the KKK didn't get created until after the war. So that whole racist thing didn't really have anything to do with the flag. So that's just another way for them to steer the narrative in a direction that they want it to go. So lastly, back to the mineral patents. All of this is, if this isn't, just enough to completely blow your mind and completely rewrite history on Jesse James and the Federal Reserve, the Knights Templars, the KGC, the whole thing, secret military order behind it all. That the Giant J also, the actual mine on the Giant J is also known as the Black Eagle, which the Black Eagle is known as the trust fund that has funded the black projects of the CIA going back to its creation. So is that a coincidence? Is it a coincidence that on the front of what do you think the actual emblem of the Federal Reserve is? It's a Black Eagle. So that can't be a coincidence. That's just unbelievable. So Mr. Miller ties it all right back to the whole creation of everything. Everything he says is backed by facts. And so lastly, I should say, back to the mineral patent issue, which we touched on secondly, but decided to push back to the end. At some point, the Chief of Title Matters of the United States got involved and verified Mr. Miller's chain of title, and basically determined that nobody had read the laws in the mineral patents for like 100 years. and that the counties where these mineral patents are located all over the West had started fake chains of title on all of them, basically uncovering a huge fraud on all these mineral patents. So Mr. Miller basically is unleashing lost wealth. He had found more lost wealth than anybody ever in history collectively, because some of these are worth millions or billions of dollars individually, and collectively they're worth trillions with a T, because there were thousands of these mineral patents issued from 1840 to 1920-ish. And because there's federal laws in the patents that make them federal jurisdiction, there's no property taxes. The county has no authority to assess property taxes. And so therefore they're still sitting out there in the vast wilderness where your ancestors left them. And under federal law, they go to next of kin. So even if they left a will or didn't leave a will, if they left a will, most likely that person that it was left to didn't do anything, so it would go to their next of kin. If there was no will, then it goes to the original person's next of kin, who is alive today, who has absolutely no idea. We've pulled a number of people out of the studio, and nobody seems to know if they had an ancestor that settled a gold mine during the gold rush. So Mr. Miller is actually releasing a lost gold mine gold rush on us as we speak. And it's really just unbelievable. You need to do some genealogy research or something in order to determine, exactly what it is you might own. Because, you can't do anything about it if you don't know about it, right? That's that's pretty much it's pretty much it in a nutshell. The story is just beyond anything. It's definitely the best story of the year, if not the decade, if not the century, if not ever, So, thanks for tuning in to Coast Live.